First off, I should apologize for the spiciness of this title in regards to the argument I ultimately make. More accurately, this paper is about three manners in which gender was performed in pre-Norman Ireland, not excluding further examples of contemporary gender expression, such as among celibate clergy or Christian ascetics. But a more precise title like three exemplars of gender performance in Middle Irish literature concerning Norse and Gaelic laity, it's a lot less snappy and may fall apart under its own weight. Hopefully, you will still benefit from this brief discussion of cross-sociolinguistic gender norms, rather than a definitive guide to all possible forms of medieval Irish gender expression. I am writing my doctoral thesis about the characterization of the Norse in Ireland in three texts, circa 1030 to 1130, written in the Middle Irish language. My work is about the medieval Gaelic perception of their own history concerning the Vikings, which reveals their perceived relationship with the descendants of those Vikings in Ireland, the Hiberno-Norse. After the Cairo-Norman invasion of 1169, Irish literature becomes fraught with the weight of invasion and conquest. In short, it becomes the story of the colonized. This darkens and clouds the history of the Vikings, who become proto-Normans and colonizers themselves in the literature. But these texts, composed before 1169, show a more nuanced view of the Norse in Ireland. Here, they speak a different language and operate using different technology and living patterns than the Gaels, but nonetheless intermarry the elites in willing exchange, join their dynastic struggles and territorial disputes, and bring innovation and wealth to Ireland. In composing my thesis, I combed out themes from the data of the narratives and found several important strands with which to weave chapters. One of these is gender, both the specific, although not necessarily named women who influence the tale significantly, as well as the shape of masculinity denoted by speech and action about righteous and/or manly attributes, or their lack. In all three texts, I noticed a glaring difference between the heroism attributed to Norse and Gaelic figures, whereas women were accorded the same values regardless of their origin. I believe this has to do with the permeability of women between the two socio-linguistic groups, that is, the historical reality of intermarriage, as well as concubinage and enslavement. Since the study of gender has to do with the formation and transgression of social borders, it seemed appropriate to explore this trichotomy in a paper for this conference. My thesis follows 8 women who influence the plot of the stories. Their individual profiles are too complex to explore here, but it's suffice to say that the sisters, mothers, wives, and daughters of the men who characterize the stories afford more than a passing mention in the narrative. These are elite men from prominent families, however, so these women having a voice and decision over the events is likely a product of their class rather than reflecting a reality of female participation in politics. Most notably, these women often relate to more than one man at a time and thus weave 2 families together by marriage within these stories. This can bring peace to dynasties and competition, but also headaches for later genealogists by the convolutions of elite families. Polygamy was not intentionally practiced, but sequential marriage via divorce was common for wealthy men and women. Spread out over a lifetime, this could result in several generations with the same parent. For instance, according to the annals, Curville's sister Land was married to Mael Shecklin I, who also had an unnamed daughter, presumably by another woman, who was then herself married to Curville. This wasn't even Land's first marriage, however, and her son of a prior union became a king in his own tua. There's also a theme in this literature of a woman's divided loyalties between her father's and husband's priorities. Brian Boru's wife, Gormlin Ingen Murchada, was first married to the king of Dublin, Avlum Coran, and bore him Sitrick, who inherited his father's title. The historic annals are not clear as to when she divorced Avliv, or if she divorced Brian and remarried, but the Cogad depicts her literary version as advancing her son Sitrick and her brother Maelmorda's mutual interests against her husband Brian. Brian is doubly entwined with the kingship of Dublin, as his daughter Slania, by another woman, is married to Sitrick, his stepson. Though unnamed within the Cogad, Slania delivers numerous quips to Sitric during the course of the Battle of Clontarf that indicate her allegiance remains with her father. This enrages Sitric to harm his wife, in one manuscript hitting her hard enough to lose a tooth. Sitric himself has holed up in his fortifications within Dublin, avoiding the battle, but nonetheless brings violence to his own private home in the form of retaliation against his wife, the daughter of his enemy Brian. The loyalty of Turgish's wife Mór is even more in opposition to her husband, as she actively helps his enemy Kellicon. She explains to Kellicon when they first converse that she fell in love with him when she saw him in battle against her husband's troops. Mór chooses to ally herself with the Gael Kellicon, warning him of an ambush that her husband, Turgish, a Norseman, has set. Mór's sociolinguistic status is unknown, because while her name and the name of her father are Gaelic, he is described as the, quote, king of the islands of the foreigners, unquote, Rig and Shigal. This could refer to the Hebrides, Isle of Man, possibly the Orkneys, but clearly by the use of foreigners. His is a Norse kingdom. Presumably, Mór's conversation with Kellicon is in Irish, while she speaks with her foreign-born husband in Norse. While not quite passing the Beshel-Wallace test, these texts also occasionally show interfeminine conversation. Mór Ingeneida, one we saw already, finds an unexpected enemy in the daughter of Donnacha, unhelpfully also called Mór. Mór Ingen Donnacha is married to one of Turgish's sons, making Mór Ingen Ea her stepmother-in-law, although their relative ages are never given. Mór Ingen Donnacha decides to take her husband's enmity with Kellicon into her own hands, and attempts to tell Mór Ingen Ea, the one in love with Kellicon, that Kellicon has died. The plan is that Mór Ingen Ea will be so distraught by her lover's death that she kills herself, and as in a Shakespearean tragedy, Kellicon himself will die of grief and his troops will lose their will to fight. This plan fails, however, as Mór Ingen Ea has a reliable source she trusts more, so she knows that the news of Kellicon's death is false. Significantly, Mór Ingen Donnacha sends woman, Mana, to speak to her stepmother-in-law rather than deliver the falsehood herself. This demonstrates that there are a group of women who function under Mór Ingen Donnacha's direction, whether by employment, enslavement, or other social obligation, and they are able to freely travel to and converse with Mór Ingen Ea. She tells them herself that they are wrong, and, quote, it would be better for you if that story was true, unquote, suggesting that the statuses of these women, whatever language they speak or how they see themselves, rise and fall with Mór Ingen Donnacha and her Norse husband. The way these women act in these three narratives is hardly feminist in a modern sense. They're fairly two-dimensional characters and always serve to directly affect a man, whether to benefit or harm. But their value and ways of acting hinge on their support of their husbands and blood relatives, not whether they are operating in a Norse or a Gaelic milieu. Within this literature, it's difficult to even tell in which sociolinguistic community a woman like Mór Ingen Ea or Gormla Ea Mercada belongs. It's intentional that these bilingual women raising children who could claim both Norse and Gaelic titles were considered part of both. It is very different for the men of these texts, however. These are dynastic propaganda narratives written to ennoble a valiant ancestor to the point of heroism. Therefore, warfare and martial prowess are constant themes, but the language used to describe Gaels and Norse in combat differs strikingly. Gaels are accorded bravery and acclaim by leaping into battle wearing fine linen and beautifully decorated accessories, indicating that their power is from their athleticism and fearlessness. The Norse, on the other hand, are described as heavily armored in metal helmets and coats of mail, and move slowly and brutally in shielded formations. I will demonstrate examples of this in a moment, but first it must be cautioned that the historical reality of 9th and 10th century military activity is not what's being described in the literature. The archaeology of Northern European warfare is poorly attested in the first place. For instance, a single helmet survives from the whole of the Old Norse-speaking region during the, quote, Viking era, unquote. It's the Geirmundbu helmet you can see on your screen. Now, common sense also suggests that combatants would utilize whatever arms and armor they could afford. Even if Norse technology outstripped that of the native Irish at first, surely the Gaels would rapidly engage in trade and other methods to obtain equipment. Rather, these narratives capture the 11th and early 12th century imagination of Viking battles in Ireland. For the Middle Irish audience, the conflict of their ancestors was characterized by the different fighting styles of Norse and Gael, and the respective societies' differing views on masculinity. The Cogad describes the Norse oppression of Munster as a synecdoche for all of Ireland, in almost entirely masculine language. It states that the Vikings have displaced every Gaelic Irish king, steward, chief, abbot, and soldier, that is, replacing the man of the house, reducing agency, quote, so that none of the men of Erin had power, unquote, to provide hospitality or to help or defend his family or people. The alliterative language literally reads, any people of the men of Ireland, emphasizing the depersonalization of the men by the loss of their leadership roles and ability to provide hospitality. The author explicitly attributes the Norse triumph to their coats of mail, to their swords and their spears, as well as, quote, their strength and their venom and their ferocity, unquote. Much later in the narrative, the Norse forces gathered for the Battle of Clontarf are described as 2,000 men, all wearing full-body metal armor of some kind. Blue or gray people, Dana Glossa, and foreigners of the armor, Gol no Lurich, further equivocate the Norse with their coats of mail. Calachoin continues this imagery, describing the forces of Olmleth as a, quote, thick, dark stronghold of black iron and a gray, polished, hard, sharp city of battle shields and a strong enclosure of stout shafts, unquote. This conflates the armored Norse with their fortified towns, another fundamental difference in lifestyle from the Gaels in Ireland. A fictional battle at Ardmacha portrays the Norse as a glittering, death-bringing circle of combatants, unquote, and later at Dundalgan, quote, a dense fortress of dark shields and an immovable oakwood of venomous and strong spears, unquote. The Gaels, in opposition, are depicted as heroically charging into battle without regard for bodily protection. Within Colin, Brian Boru and his brother Mathoin take different approaches to the Viking incursions. The latter makes truces and cedes land to the Norse in order to save his people, while the former attacks them relentlessly and gets nearly all of his followers killed. Brian chides his brother for making compromises and losing honor, while Mathoin believes that his responsibility is for his subjects' lives rather than valor. These two exemplars of Gaelic masculinity show literary tension between battle glory and protection of their charges in the pursuit of ideal manhood. Eventually, Brian convinces Mathoin that the long-term survival of their family relies on the eradication of the Norse, and they go into warfare together. Now, in order to have any chance, they have to recruit other Gaelic families, only one of which is described as having, quote, a large warrior's shield at his side, unquote. The very call to arms acknowledges that it is unequal warfare, non-foreign. This eventually results in Clontarf, of course, where the author waxes effusively about Brian's forces and allies, quote, the stainless, intelligent heroes of the Gael among with them, unquote. This description of their weapon and battle strategy comes later in the chapter, with emphasis on their cloth tunics and vests. Shields and helmets are only, quote, on the heads of chiefs and royal knights, unquote, and seem much more decorative than functional, being made of gold and gems. Surprisingly, their armory does include Lachlan axes, but they're specifically, quote, in the hands of chiefs and leaders, and only for cutting and maiming the close, well-fastened coats of mail, unquote. The leaders are also the only ones with swords. This is a very eye-catching array of men. They're certainly ready for a party, maybe not so much a battle. The point is their weapons are less formidable than the skills with which they wield them. Brian's son Murchad is described as the height of masculine ideal and, quote, the last man in Erin who had equal dexterity in striking, with a sword that is, with his right and his left hand, unquote. Now he uses this skill to break otherwise impenetrable Norse armor at their weak points, the buttons, the fastenings, clasps, and the buckles fastening the helmet. Murchad also pulls the mail coat off of another Norseman and then wrestles him to the ground, dramatically stabbing him with his own sword 3 times. Very dramatic. Kellechoin makes the difference between the Gaels and the Norse even more explicit, stating that the Gaels do not have armor, but only fancy clothing. Undaunted, in battle they put the hooks of their shields over each other and make champion knots, whatever that is, by attaching their broad belts to each other. Very daring, very dashing. But the Norse slaughter the Gaels due to their lack of armor. Now, this causes the hero Kellechon to reach a new fury and somehow overpower his technological disadvantage, inciting the rest of his men to attack with renewed violence focused on the Norse outside of their coats of mail. For example, one manages to work his spear under or through the boss of the buckler and beneath the rim of the helmet into the Norse hero, taking advantage of this weak point right here. And another performs a maneuver where he pulls up a Norseman's coat of mail and disembowels him. The really, really dirty, personal, brutal kind of fighting. The Gaels carry this brutal style of no-holds-barred fighting to Dundalgan, a shipborne battle, where they use the weight of the mail coats against the Norse by jumping onto and overloading their ships and throwing them overboard to drown. Now, these narratives explore the literary boundaries between Norse and Gaelic performative masculinity, where Norse warfare is unelegant and brutish to the Gaels, but Gaelic warfare is also brutish and poorly arranged, even underhanded in the sight of the Norse. But the best evidence of how these men occupy different standards occurs when they cross boundaries, and the author demonstrates how a change has overcome them. When the Munster forces go to fight for Kellechon with naval warfare, they must transition from Gaels to Norse in their tactics and to their very appearance and mindset. Quote, the senses and feelings and thoughts of the heroes underwent a change, unquote. I do just say the specific word for helmet in here is one of my favorite. Clogad literally means rock hat. So we kind of wonder what these helmets that these Gaels have fashioned look like. In this literature, no such transformation is ever shown for a woman whose domain is off the battlefield and whose socio-linguistic allegiance is fluid. To be a man in pre-Norman Ireland, one must choose a side by which to measure his masculinity. The Curval of Ossory saga has several mentions of a kind of people, the Gaelgal, who appear to be paradoxical. Their name means foreign Gaels. But viewed in the context of this dual avenue of masculinity in pre-Norman Ireland, their role is clear. They are men of Irish origin who have voluntarily adapted to the Norse mode of gender performance. The analyst calls them skut, which only appears elsewhere in Middle Irish as an insult, and explains that they are dalti of the Norse, a term which refers to the formal institution of fosterage, but also connotes students, apprentices. It indicates that they have learned from the Northmen, the Normanni, quote, and sometimes they are even called Northmen, unquote. For the analyst, these men who have taken on Norse methods of warfare are idiots for having given up their patrimony, a similar sentiment expressed by Brian to Mahoin and Cogad. And furthermore, whatever misfortune these foreign Gaels suffer at the hands of their former fellow Gaels is warranted. Quote, the Irishmen deserved that killing, for as the Northmen do, so they also did. 3 modes of gender expression were thus available to the laity of Ireland in the literature of the 11th and 12th centuries. There were Norse men who intimidated and shielded themselves in heavy armor, Gaelic men who performed warfare with pomp and athleticism, and women who operated in their family's best interest, whether they privileged the family of their father or of their husband. Ridicule and shame were given to those who transgressed the boundaries of their accepted performance, but only as far as they were revealed to have come from the other side. Women could inhabit both of the sociolinguistic communities, but it was deceitful for a man to do so. To be a man of honor in pre-Norman Ireland, according to these narratives, one had to choose and to live as Holy Norse or Holy Gaelic. Thank you.